Joining us now, longtime friend of mine. I was joking and describing him earlier. I'm like, he's kind of a spooky dude, right? He knows a lot. I'm not saying what he knows, but he knows a lot. How about that? He's a former Intel analyst for the Department of Defense, geopolitical analyst, and retired Marine as well. And we worked together at the Blaze. And he's been talking quite a bit about this as well. And I love what he said. Jason, first off, Jason Buttrill, welcome to the show. I love what you said when you retweeted something about TikTok suspending the uploading of new videos and streaming in Russia, because this is all virtue signaling. I mean, that's just, and it is, I agree with what you said, that's just one more outlet through which these people who are fighting this stuff in Ukraine, now they don't have that at their fingertips to get their message out. Welcome to the show. And first off, what is your take on this? What is your take on the virtue signaling? What is your take on the duration of this that Blinken was just talking about in that audio?
Well, first to address the just virtue signaling sanctions. I mean, I think that Americans really have to, not only Americans, but anyone in the Western world needs to wake up to what's been unleashed here. I have never in my lifetime, and looking and covering this for a while, when sanctions are employed, they're usually not employed directly on, the citizens of that country. That's counterproductive. They're directed usually on the government or their war-making capability, their ability to sustain, warfare. But now we're seeing something very different. We never saw this, after 9/11. We never saw this when it was being negotiated with Iran. There's never been such a unification of corporations that have signed on to this. I mean, Eurovision, FIFA. Are you kidding me with some of these? It's just absolutely nauseating how they're like, oh yeah, we're on board. We support Ukraine. We're just going to shut down all these corporations or entities within Russia that affect the common person, and then pretend like we're making a difference. But I think that, when Visa and MasterCard were added to, the list of companies that said we're not going to, work in Russia anymore, you got to stop and think, you are a fool if you don't think that that's going to be turned around on the common man in other countries in your country. It's very dangerous, in my opinion, but I think that we have to be laser focused on this weapon of mass destruction, this economic weapon of mass destruction, that they now see that, hey, we can use this just like Trudeau did in Canada. All these things we have to be, keep an eye on as this moves forward.
Yes, and I love how that's what they're focusing on as opposed to the energy sector. Talking with our friend Jason Buttrill, and that's now we have Biden going hat in hand, talking to, apparently sending people down to, we already sent, I guess, a contingent down to Venezuela to talk with Maduro's officials. And whether it's hat in hand to OPEC, hat in hand to just Saudis themselves, hat in hand to Venezuela, we're exchanging tyrants because we cannot replace the purchase of Russian crude ourselves. That energy security, where do they get this idea, Jason?
Absolutely insane. I mean, think about it. There is a Marxist dictator and a terrorist dictator in Iran. We're willing to go to them and beg and plead for oil, but we're not willing to open up the tap here. That is absolutely insane and exposes the hypocrisy of the political left all over the world. And again, more virtue signaling. But climate change is such a pivotal moment, in our lifetime, that we have to shut down all these fossil fuels in our own country. But quietly, on the other hand, they're going and begging and pleading with terrorists and Marxists to let them open up their spigots. We'll pay them the money for it, but we'll, on the world stage, tell everybody how climate change is, we're on the precipice. It's the ultimate hypocrisy, and I hope people are actually looking at it and receiving that now.
This has been described as being the first real kind of invasion. I know a lot of people like to point to Syria, but Syria is different for a number of reasons. But this is the first social media kind of war of this type, where you have one entity invading another sovereign entity. And as of such, the fog of war and the information and the propaganda is, you don't know which way to turn. I was reading some stories today. I see that Ukraine's been successful in stalling out Russia in certain parts of the country. I never know whether to buy into just how accurate, Jason, those are, because you want to believe that people are repelling this force, but at the same time, we also realize that will can sometimes be greater than resource. But is that really the case? I mean, I get that the longer this goes, the worse it is for Russia. But what really do you think, having been through this and with the amount of experience that you have with this particular subject and in this particular theater, how much of that's accurate? Do you really think that there's a chance that Ukrainians could prevail here?
No, in the long run, I do not see that. What I think is, and you're spot on with the information you get from both sides. So both the Ukrainian and the Russian side. Most of the time, when you get that, you have to throw it out. I mean, don't throw it out. Look at it, keep it in your back pocket, but don't make that the end all be all of what you think is going on in Russia. From what I am seeing, and from my sources in Ukraine, and from what they are seeing on the ground, and some of the geolocated locations that they're seeing in the Russian forces. This appears that Vladimir Putin expected this to be a 72-hour operation. He kept his most capable soldiers down in Crimea. They were part of the southern push, but the opening salvo was their paratroopers that were dropped behind enemy lines, and the Russian paratroopers are basically just glorified riot control police. Now, that says that they thought that they made a huge miscalculation. They thought there would be a lot more Ukrainians that were willing to just roll over and say, screw it. Just don't kill us, basically. But they met a massive resistance. I'm seeing tons and tons of losses, Russian losses, on the eastern flank and from the north from Belarus. That is not something that Vladimir Putin anticipated at all. I think the longer this goes on, Russia is going to be backed into a corner to where they're going to look at a Grozny situation in the Second Chechen War. That is terrifying on all fronts, because what they're looking at is, and you saw this a little bit in Syria, and maybe that's what you were referring to earlier, some people are comparing this to Syria, is that the Russians basically said, look, we don't want to engage in the urban warfare. So what we're going to do is we're going to bombard it with cluster bombs, grad attacks, and just pummel the city into the ground. Now, the thing now is that it's not Grozny, it's not Syria. You're looking at what many people believe as a European city, a major European city. So I think that also explains why he hasn't gone in with his Air Force and just started really hammering away with his Air Force. Although they have lost multiple planes over the last 7 days as well, Russia has.
Yeah.
But I think he's holding that back. I think that today they're doing another round of talks where Russia is saying, hey, look, we'll give you this if you give us that, and then we'll, jump out of here. I think that Putin in the very beginning, when I was listening to Blinken's soundbite that you were just playing, Russia was engaging in diplomacy in the beginning. They kind of laid out what they wanted to do. Now, this is hilarious because all nuance is blown out of the window on this. You cannot have any other opinion. But I do think that when NATO refused to even negotiate, when the EU was like signaling that they were going to allow Ukraine in, Putin then was like, look, I'm not just going to take the eastern breakaway regions or Crimea. Now I'm going all in. Well, now because of the resistance that he's getting, again, they expected a 72-hour operation. Now they're considering, look, maybe we should hedge our bets a little bit, go back to the negotiating table. I think that's what Ukraine's best case scenario is. Otherwise, if it goes further and further, you're looking at Grozny.
Oh, gosh. And that's not anything that we want. We're talking with Jason Buttrill, an expert on geopolitical politics and former Intel analyst for DOD. Jason, and you were talking about the breakaway regions. Apparently, so I think one of the deals that was offered to Ukraine is declaration that they're not going to join any kind of, bloc or any kind of alliance, whether it's the EU, whether it's the or NATO or anything of that nature. And then those two breakaway regions in Donbass have those declared independent areas, and then Crimea is part of Russia. And then they said that they would pack up and they would, if you believe them, they would stop the conflict. But it kind of makes me, doesn't that hamstring Ukraine also? Because you're rejecting alliances, I think, at that point.
Oh, yeah. You're basically asking Ukraine to give away 10% of their country. You can imagine any other country in the world would tell them to shove it, if they were given that ultimatum. There is very few good scenarios for Ukraine. I would be tempted to take that deal if that's what it is. And a lot of people would say, but Russia cannot be trusted. They're going to continue to go on. That's true, but that doesn't change the reality of the fact that Ukraine can also renege on what they, declare under that treaty as well. They could say, okay, fine, we are going to continue to push to join the European Union. We are going to continue to push to join NATO, even though this is kind of ridiculous because NATO was never going to allow Ukraine in as well. I don't
they
care
had that
if
strategic ambiguity too,
anyone,
like with Taiwan.
Right. Exactly. Right. They were never going to do that. What this did was it gave Putin an excuse. He's like, okay, now I have the excuse to tell my own people that I'm going to move into these these breakaway regions and push for declaration of Crimea as Russian soil. It gave them excuse. I think a lot of things gave them the excuse. The Biden administration, Joe Biden and his family, having such a close financial interest with a lot of oligarchs, that gave him another excuse.
A huge excuse. We're talking with Jason Buttrill. Do you put any stock in that story about the jets coming from Poland to Ukraine, about giving them? I read that we're giving Poland jets and Poland's giving their jets to Ukraine, so technically NATO's not supplying anything.
Yeah, that's very risky, and that's very overt, and that's exactly how we used to fight each other back in the Cold War.
Yeah.
But you can imagine if Russia or the Soviet Union back then just started giving advanced technology to the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War, how we would respond.
Right.
It's always best to look at it through that lens. We're like,
that's
okay, guys, you might want to
point.
pump the brakes a little bit on this.
That's actually what you just said. The way that you put it is a brilliant point. Have it like what? How would we react if Russia was doing this with Vietnamese back in the Vietnam War? We're talking with Jason Buttrill. Jason, last question for you, and I appreciate your time on all of this too. Maybe not last question. I might have a follow up because your answers. I love talking with you about this stuff. This the shelling of citizens is. I'm always hesitant to immediately believe everything. I don't doubt for a second that they're killing civilians. I don't doubt that for a second. Is that just a tactic of them trying to just a demoralization tactic that Russia's trying to use as a way to maybe twist the people against Zelensky? Or is that relationship between the Ukrainians and Zelensky, is it just so solid that there's not going to be anything that Putin can do on that point, and thus maybe he'll have to abandon that tactic? What is your thought on that?
Showing the Russian captives? Is that what you're talking about?
No, shelling the Ukrainian citizens.
Oh, well, I mean, I think Zelensky, right off the bat is, he's kind of born for this moment, really. He's a showman. And, I mean, anytime you look at anything from Zelensky, you take a look at, what they show from Putin, he looks like an out of touch oligarch. He really
looks like
does,
a pillow face. He won't stop with a plastic surgery.
Looks bad. Yeah, he does. But when you cross that with how you see Zelensky, he's like hanging out with his boys. You know what I mean? He's like with his commanders. He looks like the defiant leader that they're trying to portray him out to be. And I think that's very, very coordinated. Anything that, you're seeing that they're publishing with, Ukrainian citizens, even though Ukrainian people are very, very resolute, they're very, very hard. They're good fighters. They're not pushovers.
Oh, yeah.
But a lot of the stuff that you see that they're putting out on this is, you got to treat it with, how you would view any war. Most of it is propaganda, whether that's how many casualties they're releasing. One side, like Ukraine, will say, hey, there's 15,000 Russian dead. Russia will come out and say, we think there's 2,000 dead. Well, split the difference. It's probably somewhere in the middle. But that's pretty much anything else that's used for sentiment, I think, in any of these conflicts.
Man, I hope this wraps. I hope it wraps soon. I can't imagine this going out and turning into like a 10-year war. I think that's what I've heard some speculation to be. Goodness, I don't know that the world would be able to handle that. Jason Buttrill, always appreciate it. You can find him on Twitter, Buttrill, Jason Buttrill on Twitter, and follow. He's got great analysis. Thanks so much for joining us today. It's good to talk with you, my friend. Been too long.
It's a pleasure, Dan. You too. Thanks a lot.
Take care.